modern cognitive science. We're talking about the complex relationship between language, memory, and how we form a shared, collective reality. We're looking specifically at phenomena like the Mandela effect, the widespread misremembering of facts, and the larger landscape of what are called hyperstitional narratives, where fictional concepts kind of bootstrap themselves into functional social realities. So the central question before us is really one of fundamental causality. Is the widespread generation of collective false realities primarily driven by, say, the inherent structural conflict between language and our unified neural experience? Or is it fundamentally a result of strategic exploitation and deliberate disinformation by, external actors capitalizing on those cognitive flaws? My position is that strategic external manipulation is the primary mechanism. It's the most consequential factor, essentially turning structural vulnerability into a weapon.
And I take a, necessarily structural approach. While I absolutely acknowledge the profound danger, and frankly, the existence of strategic exploitation, we see it everywhere today, I argue that it's fundamentally secondary. My position is that the structural conflict inherent in language, precisely what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis describes, is the necessary and primary precondition. It's, the deep fault line in our cognitive architecture that allows any exploitation to succeed in the first place. You simply can't weaponize a vulnerability that doesn't structurally exist.
Okay, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective here, one that focuses more on utility and, frankly, control. The material we've looked at demonstrates pretty clearly that collective false memories are, a weaponizable tool. Their true significance lies not just in some kind of mild cognitive vulnerability, but in their strategic exploitation by sophisticated state actors and potentially powerful commercial entities who are very interested in managing the collective narrative. Our framework for understanding hyperstition, for instance, it shows that abstract, even purely fictional categories are made functionally real through collective behavioral modification. That transformation is the moment of critical consequence, and we know this transformation is actively hijacked. Look at the history surrounding the Benowitz case. It's a classic example of disinformation.
The material clearly shows the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, AFOS-I, deliberately fed false documents to reinforce the hyperstitional alien narrative that Benowitz was already kind of creating. This wasn't passive observation. This was a deliberate, active disinformation operation. And it was designed to serve a very real strategic goal: protecting classified assets, specifically covert stealth technology tests. The ability to exert strategic control over a narrative for real-world gain, that for me makes the external vector the essential focus, not the passive cognitive seed. The weapon determines the battlefield, not the material it's made of.
I come at it from a different way, though. We really must understand the foundation, the necessary preconditions, before we start analyzing the weapon itself. Exploitation, as you call it, is only possible because of these deeply rooted cognitive preconditions based on the very structure of communication. So I maintain that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or linguistic relativity, is the primary causal agent. Why? Because it argues that language actively sculpts and, importantly, limits reality, rather than merely reflecting some neutral pre-existing world out there. The problem starts with what you could call the linguistic rift. This is the artificial separation of phenomena that are in the brain actually neurologically unified. We have solid evidence of this structural flaw, particularly in temporal memory. Consider nostalgia and déjà vu. Linguistically, we treat them as, almost opposites. One, a longing for the past. The other, this confusing feeling of the present being a repeat.
Right.
Yet our research shows they share a remarkable 70% overlap in activated brain regions. Language forces them into separate binary categories, creating this inherent cognitive dissonance. The Mandela effect, whether it's the classic Berenstam-Bears confusion or misremembering historical events, is essentially the mind's large-scale attempt to remedy this internal clash. The brain, you see, seeks that holistic, unified time echo sensation, while our language constantly fragments that experience. And that creates the vulnerability that external actors, later exploit.
Core debate, the structural origin of this vulnerability. If this were simply some mild exploitable glitch, it wouldn't be so systemic, so instant. The vulnerability is created not by external suggestion, but by the internal imposition of linguistic structure itself. And the neuroscientific evidence really backs this up.
We observe neural binding conflicts occurring within a lightning-fast window. We're talking 100 to 200 milliseconds of linguistic categorization attempts. So when a word forces a distinction onto what is actually a unified neural experience, the resulting instability triggers signals like the frontal N400 component. This is a recognized marker of processing difficulty related specifically to semantic and linguistic interference. This confirms that the very act of applying language actively creates the necessary instability in memory formation right from the outset. This isn't passive at all. The Sapir-Whorf principle is aggressively shaping the ground we stand on. The foundation is unstable before any external actor even arrives on the scene.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I'd move from the structural potential to the actual observable outcome. You're right that the N400 signals an internal cognitive product, momentary vulnerability, sure. But if the structural vulnerability were truly the primary causal agent, why do 99% of linguistic ambiguities not bootstrap into shared collective false realities? We have countless linguistic separations, countless moments of N400 spikes, probably, that do not result in cultural myth generation. The vast majority of these internal conflicts remain contained, localized, and ultimately irrelevant to shared consensus reality. That suggests, to me at least, that the internal conflict is merely a precondition, necessary perhaps, but certainly not sufficient cause. It remains an endogenous cognitive product until it is given external energy and form. The linguistic separation is the blank canvas. Yes, I'll grant you that. But until an external actor provides the highly charged linguistic avatar, the label, the hyperstition, and crucially, the emotional valence required for social spread, that canvas just sits there unused in the attic. And this focus on external energy brings us directly to the utility of hyperstition as a deliberate reality generation technology. We are talking about engineered feedback loops here.
Disinformation operations exploit these well-documented cognitive dynamics, specifically the social transmission of error. We know, for example, that 64% of individual false memories become collectively shared within just 3 discussion rounds. And importantly, linking these errors to emotional valence increases the spread and the persistence by something like 40%. The key here is intentionality. An external entity can strategically seed a hyper-instantial concept, let's say a specific narrative of underground alien bases like in Benowitz, as a controlled avatar. This avatar then leverages the social contagion loop, bootstrapping itself into functionally real memory differences because the emotional cultural story demands it. This isn't merely structural collapse. This is the controlled execution of a feedback loop for very strategic ends. Moreover, we have evidence concerning the longevity of these manufactured realities.
Studies involving the two-phase decay model show that false realities initially decay quite quickly, and this is key, if strategically reinforced, particularly around a critical 10 to 11-day switching point after peak attention, the narrative shifts into a second, much slower decay phase. This demonstrates a successful external lock-in. It proves that external strategic reinforcement dictates persistence.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Your focus on the social spread, the 64% transmission rate, it still misses the fundamental predisposition of the collective mind to collapse into a state when it's linguistically forced. You're detailing the mechanism of spread, yes, but not the inherent structural mechanism that makes a shared reality necessary in the first place. This is where I think the concept of quantum cognition provides a crucial analogy. Think of our unified memory state, that holistic time echo sensation we talked about, as existing in a state of superposition, much like, an unobserved coin that is simultaneously heads and tails. It's undefined, but contains all potential possibilities. The collective discussion, when it employs the separated categorical language of Sapir-Whorf labels like alien invasion versus hallucination, functions as a collective measurement.
Okay,
This measurement forces the superposition to instantly collapse into a definite classical consensus reality. The measurement process itself, driven by the categorical constraint of language, is the primary driver. The external actor merely chooses which categorical label to apply to force a specific collapse. The structural mechanism is the measurement. The external actor is just choosing of measurement is what matters most.
I appreciate the quantum cognition analogy, I do, but it risks becoming a metaphor that obscures the practical reality of control. The issue is that the measuring stick must be applied and crucially enforced to have an effect. If we focus on the ultimate measurable outcome for external actors, the strategic benefit becomes undeniable. And that is what elevates exploitation to the primary causal force, in my view. The goal isn't just to create a false memory. The goal is systematic, collective erasure of inconvenient facts. We have to return to the Benowitz case as the material proof of strategic intent. The manipulation there was specifically designed to induce socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting, or SSRIF, across the wider public. Essentially, by focusing the collective conversation, the media, the counterintelligence community, the enthusiasts, intensely on the hyperstitional narrative, aliens, underground bases, the AFOSI caused the public to systematically ignore, and thus forget, related true details, the classified military stealth tests being conducted nearby. This strategic collective forgetting is the ultimate goal of these external actors. It is, in effect, weaponized nostalgia, or rather, the ability to erase true history by providing a compelling, emotionally charged decoy story. The existence of this measurable, strategic outcome demonstrates that exploitation is the final, controlling, and, I argue, most consequential phase of the entire process.
That's a compelling argument, I admit. But have you considered that even SSRIF depends entirely on the pre-existing linguistic categories? Even if the Air Force hadn't fed Benowitz any documents, the categories created by the Sapir-Whorf principle, for example, forcing the interpretation of something strange in the sky to split along lines like alien invasion versus classified U.S. military activity, already systematically bias memory formation in predictable directions. The emergence of some kind of hyperstitional narrative becomes almost inevitable because the language structures the possibilities for us before we even begin interpreting. The brain is already predisposed to accept an explanation that fits an existing linguistic silo, whether that silo is labeled alien or government conspiracy. The strategic control system merely leverages the path of least resistance, the existing linguistically induced bias. The government isn't creating a new vulnerability. It's simply exploiting the channel that language already carved out. Therefore, the structural vulnerability remains the enduring source of bias.
Well, I maintain that the proven ability of external entities to actively hijack these precise cognitive mechanisms for measurable strategic gain, disinformation, protecting classified assets, enforcing systematic collective forgetting, and even overriding the natural decay model through intentional reinforcement, makes strategic exploitation the most consequential factor in collective reality formation. The control system is demonstrably hackable, and its greatest threat lies in the hands of those with the resources to introduce these high-valence linguistic avatars and enforce a permanent collective shift.
And I reaffirm that the entire foundation of the phenomenon rests on the structural conflict between the neurologically unified brain, which seeks holistic temporal experience, and the categorical constraints imposed by language. The fact that phenomena like nostalgia and déjà vu share 70% of activated brain regions proves the reality of that unified experience. Without the initial linguistic rift created by the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, there is simply no structural instability in the collective cognitive architecture, and therefore there's no vulnerability for hyperstition to exploit, regardless of the malicious intent of external actors.
This discussion ultimately reveals that understanding how collective reality is formed really requires an integrated view. We need to bridge the structural inevitability of linguistic interference, what you call the necessary fault line, with the strategic opportunities provided by social contagion and intentional hyperstition, what I see as the force that makes the fault line collapse into a desired state.
Indeed, And we must weigh the primary causal forces carefully, recognizing that these two pressures are constantly interacting. The material really demands that we study both the cognitive hardware, as it were, and the software of control, especially when these manufactured realities show such demonstrable persistence, apparently guided by specific mathematical models, like that two-phase decay, which highlight the strategic timing of interference. There's certainly more to explore there.